This story takes place in 1993 in a town north of Chicago called Gray's Lake. The only thing Gray's Lake is really known for is that the hard rock band Chevelle hails from there. It also has tons of new homes and these subdivisions that I like to call Lego houses because they all look exactly the same and they always seem to spring up overnight. Well, in 1993, Gray's Lake wasn't like that at all. It was just a small retirement community with a small high school as well. There were a few small businesses and a park. For the school, there wasn't even any bus service within the actual town, so if you lived in town, you had to either get a ride from your parents or walk to school. The majority of students decided to walk. Now, I didn't grow up in Gray's Lake, but I did transfer there during my sophomore year of high school. Unlike other schools I had been to, I actually made a lot of friends at Gray's Lake. I joined the drama club and was immediately cast in my first play ever. It was Harvey, and I played Dr. Chum-Lee. It was a lot of fun actually, but it mainly gave me time after school to hang out and talk with my new friends. Often we would just sit around talking way past sunset. Then we had to walk home in the dark. That didn't matter to me though. I'd never really been scared of the dark. On Friday, October 15th, it got dark very, very early. A female friend and I were the last two people to leave after rehearsal. It was only 9 o'clock at that point. Although I was only 5'7" and a whopping 135 pounds, I've always had a lot of bravado. I offered to walk her home because she didn't feel safe walking home alone. She asked me if I would be scared walking home afterwards by myself. I basically told her not to worry about me. I don't get scared very easily. Well, turns out I had never really actually been to her home before and hadn't been aware that she lived completely on the opposite side of the park. I walked her through the park to her house, said goodbye to her at the end of her driveway, and after she thanked me and walked into her home, I began my own long walk back. It was getting pretty damn cold outside, so I shoved my hands into my pockets as I walked down the street. I found the gateway into the park and entered it onto the paved bike path. I was about 1/3 of the way onto the path. I was very uncomfortable because I knew I was the only person there right away. It was also very dark. That park had very little lighting. I figured it must have been because most people don't tend to take walks in the park in the pitch black of night. Well, when I got on the path, I began looking around trying to convince myself that I was not scared, just cautious. After I walked for a while, I glanced behind me, only to see a man who looked like he was in his mid-20s, walking on the path just a bit of a way behind me. I didn't see much about him, but I could tell he was wearing a red polo shirt. I had no reason to think the man was up to anything, but I did feel my heart start to beat just a bit faster. Gray's Lake has never had much of a crime rate, so I figured I was pretty safe. Still, despite my apprehension, I figured it was best to just keep up my pace if possible. If the man was up to no good and I started running faster, he might just immediately take off running after me. Well, as I walked along, I tried not to keep peeking behind me, but anybody who's been in a situation like that knows that you always had to look. After a few minutes, I noticed that although it did not seem like it, the man had sped up just so slightly that he had actually gained on me quite a bit. I didn't get a good look at him when I looked back. I decided I should simply speed up at this point. I walked even faster, and as I glanced back, I noticed he was walking faster now too. My heartbeat began to rise, and I finally started to get scared for the first time. At least, the first time I admitted to myself. A quick peek back every now and then revealed he was gaining on me more and more. I saw the exit to the park getting closer and closer. I went ahead and sped up, basically speed walking at this point. I quit looking back, and with my heart racing, I got to the arched gateway that led out of the park. Although I tried not to look behind me, my right eye caught something in my peripheral vision, coming at me from behind at an incredible speed. I felt a jolt of electricity course through my body as I realized the man had given up the ghost and was now running at me. I was not going to be able to get away. With my heart pounding in my ears, I noticed a young boy on his bicycle pass me on my right and just keep riding away like nothing was wrong. This calmed my nerves down a bit. I decided to think through the man following me in the park, the whole reason I was even scared in the first place. Turning around to check though, I saw that he had mysteriously disappeared. I had no idea where he had gone or why he went away. I was just very glad that he did. I probably mistook him for somebody doing something bad. He may have just been messing with me, so after that I just went home. At school on Monday though, I came across my female friend. She told me that after I dropped her off, her mom had wanted to come outside and give me a ride home, but I had left too quickly for that. I told her I appreciated it, but it wasn't necessary. She then told me that her mom had been really worried about me because her father was a police officer, and her father had called her and told her there had been a rape and attempted murder at the local Shell station. She told me that earlier that night a woman had bought some gas. This was before pay at the pump was common, or as far as I'm aware, even existent, and she paid for a car wash as well. When she was going through the car wash, the clerk manually shut it down, locking her in. He then forced his way into the car wash, brutally stabbed and raped the woman, and locked her in her own trunk, leaving her for dead. He was planning on dumping the body later. He put an out-of-order sign on the car wash even. Thank God, though, the woman was not actually dead. She was able to kick out the back seat of the car and get out of the car wash and go for help. When the clerk found out she was missing, he fled from the station. He wasn't caught until the next day. I have no idea what happened that night. I'm a guy, and I doubt that a man who had raped a girl would try to rape me too. However, he did try to kill her, and if he was scared he'd be caught, he might have tried to do something to me since I was alone. I don't know. What I do know, though, is that I have since been to 2 different Shell stations, and the exact same polo shirt that man was wearing was identical to the one the employees were wearing too. All I know for the period of time that I was walking through Central Park that night is that a man who tried to kill a woman was on the loose. I should preface this by saying I'm gay, and I've always been very shy. I've always had a problem meeting new people, because I can't just walk up to people and introduce myself. Since I can't, I tend to use the internet to meet people instead. About 10 years ago, I was on a website called gay.com. While I was living in Chicago, I generally would only talk to and meet up with people in my area, because although I had a car, I didn't really want any long-distance relationships. I preferred to have people around that I could go visit on short notice. And notice is very important, as you will learn later. However, I started talking to this man in Milwaukee, or actually right outside of Milwaukee. He was actually a pretty nice guy. We got along really well, and he was very polite to me. After we had talked for about a week or so, he finally asked if we could meet up. He offered to drive down to the city and told me that we could do whatever I wanted. Well, I didn't have to drive, and he was being really nice to me, so I agreed. It was a 2.5-hour drive altogether, which I did not envy him having to undertake. When he arrived, he was pretty nice as well. We spent some time together, had lunch, went out to see a movie. It was Munich, the Steven Spielberg film, and then we drove back to my place. We didn't go inside, but we sat in the car by my bedroom window and talked for about an hour and a half. Finally, he left and went home. A few days later, he asked me if I'd like to join him up in Milwaukee. I had enjoyed our time together greatly before, and he had made the 2.5-hour drive to see me, so I thought it was the least I could do to return the favor. So, much later at night this time, I made the drive up to Milwaukee. The man lived in a house, a 2-story house that was actually very nice. He had told me previously that he was renovating it at the moment. I parked my car and walked up and knocked on the door. No sooner did he open the door than he shoved a glass of Chardonnay into my hand. He had learned from our previous encounter that I was quite a sucker for white wine. He'd also picked out a horror movie, another thing I'm a sucker for, that we could watch that night. As we were watching the movie, he was very insistent on keeping my glass as full as possible. While this didn't really bother me too much, as I love wine, it does have a tendency to go right through me. No more than 45 minutes into the movie, I had to get up and use the bathroom. He told me to walk up the staircase to the second floor, and the bathroom would be on the second door to the right. Well, I walked up there and did my thing. Coming back down, though, I had a remark on the staircase which was unusually steep. It was then that he made this comment. "Yeah, I guess if I was a serial killer or something, it'd be the perfect place to hang a body from, wouldn't it?" I was completely taken aback. That was just a very awkward thing to say to somebody who's been in your house for no more than an hour. However, we were watching a horror movie, so maybe he was just getting a bit too into the mood or something. I sat back down to finish watching the film with him, and I stopped drinking my wine. I decided I would just leave after the movie was over. When it finally ended, I thanked him for a nice night and for the wine. "Are you leaving already?" he asked. "Yeah, I really need to get home. I don't sleep well in other people's beds." He asked me if I was drunk at all. I told him no. I would need to have a lot more wine than that in order to get even a bit tipsy. He insisted that I not go home. "Well, I have 3 extra bedrooms and tons of blankets and pillows. You're welcome to sleep in any of them. I mean, I'm not going to try anything on you." Well, him trying anything on me was the last thing on my mind to begin with. My mind was still back on that serial killer comment. Another thing I should mention about me is I have a problem getting myself out of conversations. I'm really not very good at asserting myself. The more I insisted I needed to go home, the more he insisted I should stay. So finally, after about 10 minutes of this back and forth, I decided I'd try and scare him off. I'm on medications for obsessive-compulsive disorder. I take Prozac and a medication called Seroquel, which is an atypical antipsychotic. Now, I mean, I'm not psychotic, but it does help me sleep. It also comes in handy for getting myself out of sticky situations, and I hoped exactly to use it that way this time. No, I need to get home because I didn't bring my pills with me, and I need to take them before bed. See, I take antipsychotics. I made sure to pronounce it that way. And believe me, you do not want to see me if I haven't taken my meds. He kinda scrunched up his face as if he didn't believe me, and asked me what kind of antipsychotics I took. I told him it was Seroquel, and asked him if he'd like me to explain to him how they work. He refused and still tried to get me to sleep over. Eventually, I told him I had to go, though. It did take a while longer, but I did leave in the end. On the way home, I decided I would not be seeing him again. I got home at about 4 o'clock in the morning. 5 hours later, I was awakened to my door buzzer. I was on a first-floor apartment, and I had a security camera as well. I looked through it and saw that it was him. He was standing outside my door buzzing to get in. This man, who I had seen only 8 hours before, had driven all the way from Milwaukee to Chicago without calling me or giving me any indication he was coming. On a whim, he just drove a full 2.5 hours. Well, I was not about to answer that door, so I ignored it. Then I remembered that we had sit up beside my bedroom window the previous night that we'd hung out. I slowly crept over to the window and shut the blinds. Then I laid down with my back to the wall so that even if he could see in, he wouldn't see me. Sure enough, after 5 minutes, he went over to the window and started slamming on it. When he got tired of that, he went back to the front door. He continued to alternate this pattern for about an hour. Now I know what you're thinking. Why didn't I call the police? Well, honestly, I thought he would just lose interest and go away. I really had no reason to think he was going to hurt me, because there was no way he could get into my apartment. But he still definitely tried. After maybe 90 minutes of really trying to get in now, he finally gave up and went home. 3 hours later, I got an email from him. He demanded that I pay him back for the gas money he had taken to come see me. He told me he knew I was in there, and I had done a really stupid thing, a really thoughtless thing by making him drive all that way for nothing. At that point, though, I'd had enough, and I had to tell him I didn't make him drive all that way. I didn't even invite him. That's on him how creepy it was that he even showed up. He still demanded I pay for his gas money, though. I at that point told him to never contact me again. because now I had the information and an email. If he ever showed up again, I'd call the police. Well, he did stop contacting me after a while, but I think about it very often. Very often. This man was obviously unbalanced. I mean, the serial killer comment could have been attributed to the movie, but who drives that far to see someone they barely know without even telling them that they're coming? I don't know. I just stopped meeting people on gay.com after that. So I was one of those kids you see walking around zoos or amusement parks wearing a leash. Those were already a thing 20 plus years ago, but much less common, and were initially only tied around the wrist. In my case, it was actually kind of a necessity. I would always just start wandering off from the rest of my family no matter what situation or time. This led to one of my stories that led to me earning my leash. This happened when I was about 6 years old. I went to the zoo with my mom and sisters. Before every family outing, my mom made sure to give me the talk about not walking off again, or I'd face the consequences in the future. My mom was a very strict parent that always made good on her promises. She had to, being a single mother of 3. I didn't try to disobey her per se, but I often just didn't pay much attention to the world and people around me. No different this day. I behaved and followed the group for a while, but then a butterfly garden caught my attention, and immediately off I was. When I finally realized I'd separated myself from my mom and sisters again, I panicked and started walking around the zoo, searching everywhere for them. I was more afraid of what my mom's reaction would be than anything else. After a while, I somehow got it into my head that if I could just walk out, find our car, and wait there, my family would eventually find me no matter what. So that's what I tried to do. But of course, being a child, I got lost within just a couple of minutes, walking around a strange neighborhood looking for either our car or the way back to the zoo. Nothing was familiar at all, and I was crying non-stop. My mom was gonna be so furious. But then this man came right up to me. Just a normal-looking 40-year-old man, asking me if I was lost and why I was crying. I explained that I'd lost my family when we were visiting the zoo, and I was now looking for the way back. I couldn't believe my luck when the man told me he had just come from that very same zoo and saw a family there standing near the entrance waiting for a little girl with blonde hair and a baseball cap. It was still a few blocks away though, so he proposed I walk with him to his car, and he could drive me the rest of the way back. Just the mention of his car finally made me hesitate. I told him I wasn't allowed to get into a car with strangers. I was more worried about how mad my mom would be than anything else. He then said something like, "Well, that's true, but you look smart enough to know if you can trust someone." I don't remember the exact words, but it was something like that. Then he added that he'd spoken to my parents earlier when they were looking for me, so he was not a complete stranger. That didn't seem right, though. Just to test him, I asked if he had really talked to my dad, who had died just the year before. When he said that he had in fact done so, I broke down crying uncontrollably. I didn't understand the situation I was in. I was confused about everything, and scared about how angry my mom was going to be after all of this. Finally, though, my crying caught the attention of the security guard of a parking building we happened to be standing next to, and he walked over and asked if there was anything he could help with. The guy stepped aside with the security guard and started explaining the situation, but he said he was my father and that we were looking for his wife. The security guard seemed to believe him at first, pointing us in the right direction toward the zoo. The man thanks the security guard and proceeds to take my hand and start walking away. The security guard takes one last look at me and walks over to ask me in a comforting, friendly adult-to-child kind of way why I was still crying. I told him my dad was dead. He looked really confused for a few seconds, then asked if this man was really my father. I tell him again, "No, my dad is dead." In a split second, his whole face and posture changed. He turned to look at the guy, who was trying to explain now that he'd never actually said he was my dad per se. The security guard must have just misunderstood him. He was just helping me to find my mom. The security guard placed me behind him and said he appreciated the man's help, but he would be taking me off his hands now. The man immediately fled. I don't really think there was much else the security guard could have done in that situation. I explained the whole thing, and after making a quick phone call, he walked me to the entrance of the zoo, which was just around the corner from the building. From there, we were brought to the security's office, where my mom and sisters were already waiting. I feel extremely lucky for the security guard being in the right place at the right time of day, and very grateful for the extra second of time he took to verify that could have made all the difference. So when I was 13, my parents sent me to an all-girls fitness camp to work on becoming the best version of me. Well, let's be honest here. It was a fat camp, and it was as horrible as you can possibly imagine. Bad food, all-day exercise, god-awful counselors. The camp took place on a college campus, where they had us sleeping in dorms of 2 girls per room. I had high hopes, though, that it wouldn't be a complete waste of a summer, as my roommate seemed like a great girl. Let's call her Mary. We had similar interests, the same style. It seemed like a perfect match. We would chat late into the night, planning our escape from that horrible camp, bemoaning having to give up our cell phones, though I had secretly managed to sneak mine in, and talking about our families and how much they sucked for sending us here. To be honest, I was surprised she was even at this camp. She was actually pretty fit. Her parents had also signed her up for the whole summer versus mine only sending me for 2 weeks. Only 2 days into being at this place, I was pulled aside by another girl who I had become close friends with. She warned me that Mary had quite a lot of issues, and the reason why she had been sleeping in a single for X amount of time was because nobody else wanted to room with her. Well, I brushed it off, thinking it was just rumors or perhaps other girls being unnecessarily mean. That day at lunch, Mary seemed rather mad at me, and for the life of me, I just could not figure out why. So, when I got a chance, I asked her what was up. She ranted at me about how everyone was so mean, and was I going to leave too? She went on to explain how this one girl she was rooming with switched rooms because she made friends with this popular girl, and she made up lies to be popular. Silly me, I believed her. We continued hanging out, but only now am I aware enough to realize that she was keeping me from hanging out with anyone else. Near the end of my first week, the camp took us on a long walk over to the local pool. It was a big deal as it was super hot and this was only a once-a-week activity. Mary and I were super excited to go. When we got there, we quickly claimed some chairs and left our stuff there. As Mary had been at the camp for several months, she didn't have to pass some stupid "can you swim" test that I assume is mandatory in most camp settings. We were separated for about 20 minutes. After I passed with flying colors, "Thank you, swim team," I jumped into the pool and started floating around. Then I heard her calling my name and saw her waving me over to the deep end of the pool. I swam over and asked her what was up. She said she wanted to show me something. Next thing I know, her hands are wrapped around my neck and she's shoving me under the water. Now, I'm a good swimmer and I'm very capable of holding my breath for quite a long time. But never in my life had anything like this happen to me. I panicked and opened my mouth to scream. Luckily, before my mind had even processed what was happening, I had kicked up my legs and shoved her back and made a desperate escape. I somehow managed to swim away and pull myself out of the pool. As I caught my breath and began to process what just happened, I looked back at her. She was just staring at me, not having moved at all. I quickly grabbed my stuff and ran into the bathroom and called my mom. I was in tears as I explained what happened. It was very obvious she did not believe me. I stayed in the bathroom until we left to go back to the camp. I didn't leave the counselor's side the entire walk back. When we arrived at the camp, I was pulled aside by one of the women in charge. She very rudely demanded I give her my cell phone. I of course denied having one and asked why she thought I did. She told me my parents had called about some assault that had happened to me, and they told them I had called. Quickly, I excused it by saying I borrowed a phone from a lady at the pool. Thankfully, they bought that. They told me that I would be moved to a new room the next day, and that I had to spend the night with Mary one last time. Furiously, I begged them to please just let me sleep on the floor of another girl's room even, but they insisted I was being melodramatic. As soon as I was left alone, again I raced to the closest bathroom and called my mom. That's when I learned the truth about Mary. I wasn't her second roommate, or her third, or her fourth, or her fifth. I was the sixth girl to stay in a room with her. 3 of her roommates had left the camp early, and the other 2 had switched rooms at the first opportunity. All 5 of the others had made allegations of violence from Mary against them, but the camp refused to do anything and insisted she was just a troubled girl who wanted to make friends. Or as they told my parents, well, she has had some issues in the past. That night I didn't sleep at all, and neither did Mary. She sat bolt upright in bed, staring at me the entire damn night. I could feel her watching me, and I was terrified. I had my phone clutched in my hand with 911 dialed and ready to call at any moment. I practically cried tears of relief when the sun came up. That day, I was moved to a new room in a different building, and somehow managed to break my foot in the process, so my parents drove up and took me home with a cast on my foot to commemorate my time there. To this day, I've had issues from what this girl did to me, and I've never been able to live with roommates or make friends very easily after. So, a few days ago, I got back from a family holiday in the countryside on a really nice property. I'm not sure if it was through Airbnb or some other similar company, but imagine that kind of thing. A fully furnished house with more or less all amenities provided. I have a fairly wide, extended family, some of whom would be staying with us, some of whom wouldn't be, and some of whom would only be staying for a few nights before leaving early. My parents and I would be staying all week though, and we were the very first to arrive at the house. As I said before, it was a very good-looking property, not surrounded by other houses, but not completely isolated either. Because we were the first to arrive, we basically got first picks on rooms, and were able to unpack and explore the whole place before everyone else even arrived. I got my own room on the first floor. For reference, I'm 18 years old. There's one room on the top floor with a bathroom attached. Going up there, the first thing that struck me was just how hot it was in there. There were windows through which the sun was shining in, which I thought might be the source of this heat, so I shut all the blinds, but it didn't really get any cooler. Aside from the bathroom, there was another door in this room, but it was locked from the other side. It goes without saying that this was kind of weird, not the least because I had no idea what could possibly be on the other side of that door. There was a locked door downstairs too, but that one had an obvious keyhole and was very clearly a boiler room due to the sounds I could hear on the other side. But with this room, I just really had no idea what it could possibly be. There was also a small crawl space door upstairs. It didn't have a lock or handle or anything like that, but I couldn't figure out how to open it. I'm not sure how relevant that crawl space really was to all of this, but I thought I'd at least mention it as somewhat suspicious. Anyway, after a few hours, other family members arrived, including my grandparents who, being the oldest in the family, and so the most respected, got to choose a room as well and chose upstairs. Despite the fact that my grandparents are both in their 70s, they're both extremely fit, not just for their age, but for anybody really. They keep very active, and they don't get scared very easily at all. I couldn't say I really envied them taking that top room though. I'll skip most of the other details about the holiday since they aren't really relevant to the story itself, and fast forward to the first night. The property had this large garden, like really big. People at one end would have to scream for someone at the other end to even hear them. What made the property even nicer to me was there was a large hot tub out back by that garden. On the first evening, 11 p.m., I was in the hot tub by myself. Most of the other people had already gone to sleep. Having all the lights out and just sitting in the bubbling water, the only sounds audible to me were the buzzing of the jets and the chirping of the crickets. It was quite the serene experience. Just barely over the sound of the water though, I could have sworn I heard something moving down on the other end of the garden. There was no way I could be sure of that though, since it was so far away. I turned on the lights in the tub to as high as they could go, but obviously that didn't provide me with very much in the way of visibility. Looking back, it was actually probably a pretty stupid move because it made me more visible. I still couldn't see to the end of the garden, but now I kinda had the creeps. I realized just how exposed I felt, and decided to wrap up and head to bed. My room had these big glass doors that faced out into the back garden, which also made me kind of uneasy. I'd be lying though if I told you I heard any scratches on my window or something cliche like that. I actually didn't hear anything else and went to sleep perfectly fine. The next morning at breakfast though, I was talking with my grandma, who sorta dropped a bombshell on me. She told me that last night she had noticed a light turn on then off in the locked room upstairs. Not that I said anything, but this really freaked me out. I know the idea of someone secretly living in the house with us sounds dumb, and that's not really where my mind was going. Truth be told, I wasn't sure what to think. So that night I got totally drunk, like really hammered. I'm a bit of a lightweight and obviously not an experienced drinker, so it really didn't take much for me to get to that point. Regardless, I'm not exactly proud of the state I was in. I went out to the hot tub again, this time with my cousin who was a bit older than me, not even aware of my surroundings. The heat of the water combined with the effects of the alcohol made my brain basically turn into mush. I couldn't think clearly, and that's by my own admission. We were just listening to music and sort of chilling, when she suddenly pointed over at the other end of the garden to get my attention. "Hey, do you see that?" she asked. The garden had these automatic lights along one side, so if there was any movement they would turn on, illuminating one half of the lawn. From what I had seen, 2 of them, they weren't super sensitive, so you would have to get really close. I peered over the side of the tub but couldn't see anything in the dark. That's when my cousin had the bright idea to reach over the side and throw a football onto the garden. The sound it made as it thudded onto the grass still makes me feel sick. The lights flashed on, revealing a dark figure scurrying behind the fence at the back of the yard and just out of sight. We should have probably gotten out of the tub and went to bed at that point, or in reality called the cops, but for some dumb reason, we decided to go and investigate ourselves. She was a few drinks in too, I'll note. Not as much as me, and she keeps it down much better, but we both had some liquid courage going, if you know what I mean. Once we got there, it was too dark to see much, but the fence was very clearly broken, to the point where someone could easily squeeze through the gap in it and make their way onto the road adjacent to the property. That alone is creepy enough, but what really freaks me out is what happened the next day. For a little bit of context, I'm in the build-up to some really important exams right now, and just because I was on holiday didn't mean I would be cutting myself any slack in studying. Because of this, when my whole family went out that day, I stayed home to work. In my room, there was this rubber door stopper thing propping my door open, and a spare one in the drawers as well. I left the one propping the door open next to it, in case I wanted to keep the door open, or more realistically, keep it shut. Bear in mind that particular door did not have a lock on it. I kept the second one hidden under my bed in a really specific place you would never find unless you were deliberately looking for it, tucked away in the bed frame basically. The door doesn't close by itself, but if there's a draft, it will eventually slam shut after some time. At some point, I got very bored of studying and decided to go make myself a drink and get some snacks. What can you do? While in the kitchen, though, I heard this loud thud come from my room. Because of the way the kitchen was positioned, I couldn't actually see my door, though. At first, this understandably freaked me out, but then I heard the front door open. It was just my family. I put it out of my mind and returned to my room, only to see that the rubber door stopper was balanced on the door frame, just flush against the wall. I assumed it must have been someone in my family. I walked back in, only to see that the other stopper was still next to the door. I questioned my family at dinner. They all swore up and down they hadn't moved a single thing. This created some quite nasty implications, mainly that I had been home alone with someone, or perhaps something. I'm not sure which is scarier really. Luckily, nothing else of this nature happened during my trip, and needless to say, I was grateful just to get home. This remains the creepiest thing that's ever happened to me. I haven't told my cousin about the incident, since I figure I'd probably just sound crazy. I can only speculate too as to whether or not this was related to the incident from the night before. I'd like to think they're not, but I'm fairly certain about what I saw. My only advice to anyone using Airbnb or similar services is to thoroughly research the area you'll be staying in and make absolutely sure the property is secure. This is a real story, but some of you might probably not believe me. I usually don't even talk about this because of the trauma and the fact that people look at me like I'm crazy when I tell them about it. This was on the news too, but out of privacy and respect, I won't share the articles or the news clips here. Anyways, this story is about my intuition and my friend's at times strange older brother. I'll call him Corey and I'll call her Cara. I always used to play over at her house all the time, considering her mom and my mom were the best of friends. Back then, the whole neighborhood was basically a playground, and it honestly felt so much bigger as a child. The world can be a scary place, but I always had common sense, and that kept me in one piece, considering I was very accident-prone. Anyways, I'd play a lot at Cara's house, but I always had the weirdest feeling around her brother Corey. It felt like he was constantly watching me, and it made me very uncomfortable. He seemed to be popular, and everyone always hung out around him, but every time I was around him, I just felt very sick. He would do these things like kick small animals and make them yelp. He was very aggressive when he played with us too. One time he held my head underwater when we went swimming, and another time he watched me change in the bathroom. I noticed him after I got dressed, and saw the door cracked open. I didn't see him, but I felt his presence there. Sometimes it even felt like his own mom was scared of him. One day, I went over to Cara's house when I was in middle school. The door was unlocked, so I just walked right in. I thought they were home because I smelled spaghetti cooking, and I loved Cara's mom's cooking. I turned around. There was Corey acting just like normal. Nothing rang a bell at first. I asked him where Cara and her mom were. He said they had just gone to the store. He said I could go into Cara's room and wait for her to get back. I almost did, but I felt him looming behind me as I was about to go into her room. This was normal, just like every other time, but for some reason I got terrified out of nowhere. It felt like I was suffocating, and my throat started to hurt, and tears started to form in my eyes. I turned around and looked at him, and all of a sudden I just started begging him to let me go with tears pouring from my eyes. We stood there for 5 minutes in suffocating silence, and then he just said I could go. I faced him as I slowly backed up toward the door and ran all the way back home. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, he had already killed himself. Cara was found dead in her bed, and her mom was found dead in hers as well. He had stabbed them both to death. To this day, I still don't know why he let me go and didn't kill me too. So growing up, I loved to explore abandoned places, which led to me driving a lot at night because I loved the thrill of it. Those stories are for another day though. This story is one of those night drives. This happened about 15 years ago, so some of the details might be a little hazy or different than what actually happened, but I'll try my best to recall it as accurately as I can. My friends and I decided we would take a weekend trip to the ocean. We were all prepared for the trip and ready to leave when I suddenly got a call from work. Trying to be a responsible young adult, after much frustration and moaning, I obliged to go into work. I told my friends to just leave without me. I would leave after work and meet up with them there that night. When work finally ended, the sun was already starting to set. I knew it would be a night drive, as the ocean was a 3-hour drive away. I hopped into my car and began the drive to meet up with my friends. As I didn't have a GPS in my '06 Honda, I looked up the fastest route there before I began my journey. I found out that if I took this 2-road highway, it would cut 30 minutes off of my trip, so I made the decision to take this route. An hour into my drive, there were more and more trees, and less cars. At this point, it was very dark, and any light poles were far and few between. The headlights were my only source of light at this point. My eyes had just begun to adjust to the darkness when I saw a figure off to the side of the road with their thumb out. Me, thinking that people aren't always bad and always willing to help, decided to slow down to see if there was anything I could do. I was always taught as a child to help whoever I can, so it wasn't anything that I thought long and hard about. As my car came to a complete stop, I could tell the person was a middle-aged woman. I cracked my passenger side window and asked if she needed any help. She came closer to the car and looked me up and down. Then she said, "Hey, would you give me a ride over to the next town?" At this point, there were no red flags yet. I didn't really think her request was that weird, so I agreed to give her a ride. I was an average-sized 18-year-old, and she was very small in stature, so I knew if anything happened, I could take her. I unlocked the door for her and she hopped right in. As soon as she sat down, she began to profusely thank me. Looking into her eyes, I could see she had clearly been crying. She introduced herself as Molly and said, "Just to the next town, please." Then she started staring out the window. I started driving and began to ask her some questions, just so the car ride wouldn't be awkward silence, you know. I already knew the next town was near the ocean anyway, which was my destination. It would be another hour or so before we would reach it, so it would be really weird to just sit there in silence. When I asked her what she was doing here in the middle of nowhere on a highway, she said her and her boyfriend had gotten into a big fight on their way to the ocean, and he had kicked her out of the car. Somehow in my young mind, I still didn't see the danger in this. I began to console her and tell her how sorry I was, when she quickly turned to me and yelled, "Hey, slow down!" My instincts kicked in and I slammed on the brakes, thinking maybe there was something in the middle of the road I hadn't seen. What's wrong? Molly says, "Oh, I thought you missed the turn." Now, this small highway had cross streets about every half mile. "I thought you said you were going to the next town, to the ocean." She gave me the creepiest smile and said, "Oh no, I live out here. I don't really feel like going to the ocean anymore." Red flags started to go off in my head. I gave her a weird look. "Are you telling me you live out in the middle of those woods?" Sweat started to run down the side of her face. "Yeah, sorry." We continued on our drive, only now I was a little bit nervous about this stranger I had randomly picked up. She turned to look out the window again, and this time she wouldn't say a single word to me. Clearly something was very off. I kept her in my peripherals. Finally, after what seemed to be an hour but was only actually a couple of minutes, she says, "Slow down. The turn is coming up." But this time, she didn't even turn to look at me as she said it. As the car began to slow down at the crossroad, I saw two shadows duck quickly behind a tree. Being somewhat afraid now of what might happen if I took that turn, instead I slammed on the gas and drove right past. Molly began to scream at me to stop and go back. At this point, my adrenaline was quite high. I knew had I turned where she asked me to, something horrible was going to happen to me. About 10 minutes down the road, I finally stopped the car and yelled at Molly, "Get the fuck out of my car!" I grabbed the BB gun I had on the side of my door and pointed it at her. "Get the fuck out of my car or I will shoot you!" She frantically opened the door and fell out. She started running back the way we came. I sat there with my passenger side door open, still pointing the gun at nothing but trees, as I watched her disappear into the darkness. After a few moments, when I'd finally calmed down, I reached over to my passenger seat to close the passenger door, only to see a knife on the pavement where she'd fallen out of the car. I quickly closed that door and sped to the ocean where my friends were waiting. That was the very last time I ever picked up a hitchhiker. A few years ago, I worked as a janitor for a cleaning company. We cleaned all sorts of places: churches, schools, doctors' offices, you name it. The job was mostly night shift and sometimes took us to some of the more sketchy areas that were around. We had one job we went to twice a week. It was this small dentist's office, located in an office park surrounded completely by woods, on the section of road where the main, more urban road started to change into a desolate country one. When I say this office was small, I mean it was really, really small. This is an important detail to remember for the story later, as it is relevant. The office consisted of a tiny lobby when you first walked in. Then behind a window in the lobby was a little reception area, where there were various file cabinets and 2 workstations. Beyond that, straight through there, was a narrow hallway with little rooms where the dentists would do their various cleanings and procedures on patients. At the far end of the hall, there was a door that led to a basement, and a slightly larger room on the right that contained 2 or 3 dentist chairs. The kind where you sit on it and recline so the dentist can see into your mouth. That was the layout of the entire office. Like I said, the place wasn't very big. The first incident was when I was with my work partner, Matt. I was the one the boss had left in charge, and therefore it was my responsibility to walk the halls and inspect everything before we left the job site to make sure everything was done properly. It was also my responsibility to set the security codes to each building before we went out. So while I did this, I sent Matt outside to the dumpster with a bag of garbage, which we had accumulated from the office. The dumpster was on the far end of the parking lot up against the woods. While I was inspecting the rooms to make sure nothing had been missed by either of us, I spotted some dirt on the floor, so I plugged the vacuum back in and began to suck up the dirt. Since we were packing up the work truck with all our supplies and it was a warmer night out, I left the office door open while Matt was going to the dumpster. This would make it easier to take our supplies out from the office. As I was vacuuming, I realized Matt was taking an exceptionally long time to come back from the dumpster. He wasn't normally the type to mess around and cause delay either. I turned the vacuum off and poked my head out the front door, only to see Matt sprinting away from the direction of the dumpster, his face contorted with fear. "Hey man, what the hell's wrong?" He started pointing and turned, panicking and gasping for breath as he tried to explain what he'd just seen. "Didn't you just hear me scream?" I told him no, as I'd been vacuuming and had just turned it off to see where he'd been. He told me that when he went to put the garbage in the dumpster, some guy was crouched in the dark muttering gibberish to himself. When Matt saw him, the guy got up and screamed and started sprinting at him. He told me he drew his pocket knife to try and scare the guy off and possibly defend himself if needed. Fortunately, it worked. The guy turned around and sprinted off into the woods, but he wasn't sure if he was still in the area. He wanted to leave for the next job site immediately. I will say that what I did next was neither smart nor very nice to Matt. See, I was quite troubled at this point in my life, to the point where I didn't really care what happened to me. I was also a bit cocky as I had done martial arts for 4 years and took it quite seriously, often boxing against people way bigger and stronger than me, so in my own mind I was pretty tough. I was also a bit of a kiss-ass towards my job as I liked it perhaps a bit too much back then. I noticed Matt hadn't actually put the garbage in the dumpster, and I told him we'd have to go back to put it in, since we couldn't very well just leave it in the parking lot. He asked me if we couldn't just put it in the back of my car and drive it to the next job and dispose of it there. I told him no, as I didn't want it stinking up my car, and besides, where's the fun in that? Yeah, I was kind of a bit of a prick and a bit crazy. The look on Matt's face suggested he thought the very same thing. I laughed it off and told him I'd go with him, but first I had to get something out of my car. I went and grabbed this big heavy metal flashlight I had. It was super bright, so not only could it be used to see, but it could also be used to blind someone, and perhaps as a weapon if need be. I locked the door to the car and took the lead with my flashlight, while Matt carried the garbage bag and his pocket knife. I shined my light first at the trees near the dumpster. I didn't see anything, so I shined it at the dumpster itself. Still nothing, so I called out, "Hey, who's back there? Come out right now, you piece of shit," trying to sound tough. Truthfully, I was just looking to be a bit of a fake badass. I knew that whoever that person had been, they had probably run far off into the woods, never to be seen by either of us again. When we got to the dumpster, I walked around a 10-foot distance from its right side and shined my flashlight behind it. There was no crazy man there. I told Matt, who was hanging about 20 feet back now, that it was safe for him to put the garbage in. He did, and then we went back to the car and moved on to the next job. The second incident occurred at the same place about a year later. I was working with this new guy named Andrew, and we were cleaning up just like at that time with Matt. We had all our supplies at the front of the building by the door, and I was getting ready to set the codes for the night. We had been through the whole building, both of us, and seen every room, desk, and chair. We were the only ones in there for sure. That's when I heard a faint whispering begin coming from the other end of the hall that I mentioned earlier, the one by the basement door which we weren't allowed to go down. We never even checked down there since it wasn't part of our job. We didn't even know what was down there, but we had been in this office together for at least an hour, and we hadn't heard or seen anyone. It was well after closing time. The whispering sounded like two women. At first, I thought I was just hearing things, but when I looked over at Andrew, he looked back at me with his eyes wide open. He said to me quietly, "What the fuck is that?" I asked him if he was hearing what I was hearing, just to confirm. He said yes. We both stood staring down that hall. The whispering stopped for a second, then started up again and started to get closer. We both turned to look at each other. "Fuck that, man, we're not getting paid enough for this. Let's go." I set the alarm codes and we walked out and locked the door. I was now a bit smarter and less macho than the last time. To this day, I still don't know what all of that was about. Sometimes I guess buildings make noises, the wind settling or whatever, but to have two people hear the same thing at the same time, combined with that crazy guy incident from a year prior, just seems weird. I know that some of these medical-type buildings have different drugs stored in them, and sometimes people did break into them to steal the drugs, so maybe it was that, but I don't really know. Anyways, I don't work there anymore, and I haven't for a long time, which I'm glad about that.